to get to the real reason we are all here tonight. I'm so excited to introduce our featured speakers. Michael Heller, who is the class of 1980, is one of the world's leading authorities on ownership, on who gets what and why. He is the Lawrence A. Wine Professor of Real Estate Law at Columbia Law School, where he's also served as a Vice Dean for Intellectual Life. And his writings range over innovation and entrepreneurship, corporate governance, biomedical research policy, real estate development, African American and Native American land ownership, and post-socialist economic transition. And in each area, Michael really helps people see and cure ownership dilemmas that no one had really previously noticed. Helping to lead our discussion tonight with Michael and our discussion about his book is classmate Arshad Mohammed, who is a reporter for Reuters covering American foreign policy. He actually joined Reuters in 1988 and has worked as a correspondent in New York, in Paris, Algiers, Washington, covering the White House and the State Department, and is now here based in DC as a diplomatic correspondent. During the pandemic, he's worked mostly from his living room overlooking 37th Street, just 4 blocks away from the Sidwell Friends campus. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Arshad to get us going. And thank you again for being here tonight.
Thanks very much, Anna. Thank you all for being here. It's delightful to see so many old friends and classmates, and in some cases, parents of classmates. And if I may say so, you are all more beautiful than you were 40 years ago. It's a delightful book, Michael, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about it. I'd like to start with one of your introductory anecdotes, which I think of as the paradox of the airplane seat. Let's imagine you and I are on a plane together. I have flipped open my laptop and want to start getting to work on a story. You are wanting to relax after the rigors of your book tour, and you push the button on your airplane seat and slide back. Who owns that space that I want to use for my laptop and my work, and that you want to use to rest? Whose is it?
Well, I certainly think it's mine. Because I have that little button and I push the button and the seat goes back. So it seems to me that that space is attached to my seat and therefore it's mine. I imagine that's not your view. I imagine your view. Let me ask you, what's your view?
My view is that it's mine because I've got the tray in front of me. It may be attached to your seat, but it's manifestly attached to my space, which I have paid for and wish to use.
Yeah, and if I lean back into your space, maybe attached to mine, but I'm taking something that you possess, like that's your space, and you were there first. Mm-hmm. And actually that little conflict happens all the time, right? We've all had that experience of leaning back and being leaned into. That turns out to be, it's not just a fight over the wedge. That turns out to be an ownership battle that we're having. Like we're telling different stories about whose space that is. I'm saying it's mine because it's attached to something mine. And you're saying it's yours because you possess it. And those are 2, actually, of just 6 simple stories that everyone uses to claim absolutely everything in the world, not just that wedge of space, but everything, everywhere in the world. Attachment and possession seem very simple. Attachment, that little button, is possibly the most important ownership story that most people don't even know exists. It's why your home is your castle. It's why you own stuff up in the air and down underground.
So here's a question. I mean, fundamentally, American Airlines or whatever airline we happen to be on owns the space, right? I mean, it owns the plane is flying through the air, we're on it, we're paying to be on it. Explain to me why it is they don't make a clearer set of rules about that space so that, I mean, you and I are very polite. We would never argue over this, but people do argue. People get into fights, planes land, people get dragged off. Explain to me why there is this almost intentional, ambiguity.
Well, you said almost intentional. There's nothing almost about it. Deliberate ambiguity about that wedge of space is a advanced technique of ownership design. It's something that airlines do, not for your comfort, but for their profits. They realize that by keeping it ambiguous, you and I and most of the millions of people sitting in front and behind on every flight and every seat every day, most of us are going to work it out politely. And they count on that. So they keep the ownership ambiguous in order to sell that same space twice, for me to recline and at the same time for you, for your needs and your laptop. And also what's even better for the airlines is that all the discomfort that creates, that's what creates the market for the expensive seats up front. So deliberate ambiguity is a tool. It's not an accidental tool. It's a deliberate tool that airlines use. There actually is a rule. The rule is most airlines have the rule that if you want to lean back, you can, but they never announce the rule and they don't enforce it except in those, strange cases when people actually get into fistfights over it.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to launch the survey?
I'm actually curious. So Arshad and I were talking about this. We're wondering what you all think here who are here tonight. So do you think it's okay to recline your seat on a crowded plane if there's someone behind you? And I want you to sort of weigh in. It's not this is not science. This is just, you don't have to think about it very much. If it can recline, I'm reclining. Are you with me on the front seat? Or no, just don't do it. Are you with Arshad in the back seat? So we'll give you maybe 5 or 10 more seconds. Again, there's no right answer. Just press, whatever seems right to you. Okay, everyone had a chance? Let's wrap it up. So I'm showing you the results here. And it's actually, that's actually really cool to me. So in this audience, about 50 of you voted, and it really was within one person of being evenly split. And I've asked this question actually in many different audiences. And it's almost always exactly split. And what's amazing is that most people are pretty confident in their view. Most people say, listen, it's obvious, it's natural. And part of what's happening there is that these ownership stories, if possession, the tray table, reclining, the attachment button, they feel so natural and right that I hope at least some of you are surprised that half the people here tonight think exactly the opposite.
So I'm delighted to say that our classmate Martha Hausman says in the chat room, Carol Gilligan would say that is an entirely male construct or framework. Why can't we just talk about it? And
I so agree with you, Martha. That is so right. So and indeed, actually, there have been studies about this, specifically about the airline reclining seat. It turns out that people won't just not recline if you ask them. And they also won't not recline if you pay them $20. But if you offer to buy the person in front of you a drink or a snack, 3/4 of the people in front won't recline. So if you want news you can use from tonight, next time you're on a plane and somebody leans back into your lap, don't offer them money and don't just talk with them. Offer them some food. In many cultures, an offer of food is that hospitality really makes a difference. And it absolutely does on airplane seats.
So another anecdote in the book that I really love, and in fact, I love it so much, I'm going to describe it and then read a short section of it. It has to do with very important babies daycare. So this is a daycare center where there was a gigantic mural of 5-foot tall images of Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Goofy, Donald Duck. The children really enjoyed the mural. That is until the Walt Disney Company sent its investigators to document the mural and then start threatening the daycare center with the possibility of a lawsuit if it didn't take the mural down. So I'm going to read you just one very short paragraph. The kids were upset. Quote, "If they took them off the wall, I'd be sad," said Christopher, age 5. "It's not fair at all," said Amanda, age 7. Erica Scotty, the daycare director, expressed it in grown-up terms. "I think it's totally ludicrous." So explain to me why a behemoth like the Walt Disney Company would choose to do battle with a tiny daycare center and 2 of its, affiliates over what you would think might be something they would like, which is to say, encouraging young, impressionable children's attachment to their product.
Actually, that story goes way back to Walt Disney himself. When he started out, his big hit was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. That's how he made his name. And he lost it. He lost it in bankruptcy. And he was so mad and so upset. He took a long train ride back from New York. And on it, he came up with his hit character, Mortimer Mouse. He was done with rabbits at that point. And then by the time he got to LA, he had renamed it Mickey Mouse. And that became the foundation of his empire. He actually voiced Mickey Mouse for the early decades of the cartoon. And he was relentless about protecting his claim over Mickey. So he set the foundation early in Disney's history. Disney has the most ruthless set of litigators you can possibly imagine. You know, it's not this organization or that, it's Disney. This may be the most magical kingdom, but their lawyers are known as the Disnoids, and they sue anybody who dares to make use of Mickey Mouse's image. So that's the origin of it. But you know, Walt Disney is long dead. The company makes billions off of Disney. It's the most valuable celebrity in the world is Disney. I mean, is Mickey Mouse, yeah, and still to today. So every so often, every 20 years or so, the copyright term is about to expire on Mickey. When that happens, Disney goes to Congress, makes contributions to the right people, and basically buys 20 more years of copyright term. So Mickey Mouse is still under copyright almost 100 years after Walt first drew it. And they are relentless about policing even these little daycare centers.
But what is the net benefit to them in that instance? I mean, you know, the kid just makes the kids happy. How is it a fundamental? How is the fact that somebody somewhere is violating a copyright going to necessarily impede their ability to make movies with Mickey Mouse, or you know, drop people to their parks? Or
well, that example, the Very Important Babies, was actually a turning point for Disney. They had such bad publicity. Universal Studios came in and painted Scooby-Doo over the Disney mural. They brought the television crews in, and it just was a huge day for Universal and a terrible day for Disney. And since then, they've actually have a very different strategy. They now actually, since that time, tolerate a lot more theft of their product. They realize that that suing your customers and suing the kids is bad strategy. It's the same, actually, if you remember Napster 20 years ago, when the music industry basically sued all of us, and it turned the public largely against the music industry. So since then, a lot of owners of IP, of intellectual property, the copyrights and the trademarks, they've realized that they're actually better off tolerating a large amount of theft and not pissing off their customers. They can bring them in as customers, you know, like you said, from a very young age.
One of the other anecdotes that you had in that had to do with Disney using sort of small craftspeople on the internet, presumably people who sell their products on Etsy or elsewhere. And somebody came up with the idea of a rose gold studded set of, I don't know if they were Mickey Mouse ears or.
Yeah, they were the ears.
Yeah, awesome. And Disney didn't sue them. Why?
Well, this is the new Disney. So after a century of suing everybody for everything, they realized that tolerating theft is actually a really powerful business strategy for them. That what tolerating theft in that case does, tolerating these fan websites, is they use them as basically cheap product development. So when Bibbidi Bobbidi Brook came up with the rose sequined ears and they were a huge hit, Disney said, oh, wow, that's a great product. And they started manufacturing it and selling it as Disney stores, where it was a huge hit. So it turns out that tolerating theft, even when you're an owner, often is actually quite a profitable strategy, as well as the right thing to do.
So they basically, though, they ripped off Bibbidi Bobbidi idea.
Absolutely, and that's true. In people tend to think that I own the copyright, I own the idea. There's the basic background rule in America for ideas is that copying is okay, and in many of the most sort of creative industries, that is the rule. So in fashion, for example, there's absolutely free copying of designs. You see something on the runway, and it's in Zara within days, and that fashion industry is actually quite creative, with no ownership whatsoever. It's true for comedians' jokes. When comedians tell jokes, they don't own them, and they still are, feel fine going out and telling the joke. Same with coaches who come up with new sports plays. They don't own those plays. They just win a game with them.
So one of the things we were talking about before this was, this is really a hypothetical to me because I've never had cable TV. But
what have you been doing all these years?
I know. I read and I nap, and so, and not necessarily in that order. So explain to us, tell us about kind of password sharing. I will admit, I have a Netflix account, and so does my wife. So in this case, we're probably doing something quite stupid. We're paying Netflix twice for, something that we could only use once. But tell me why HBO and others let people share passwords. And actually, I think we may also have a poll on that if you want to run that.
Sure. So let me say a sentence about that, and then we'll get to this. So the same strategy that Disney is using with online pirates websites, tolerating them, HBO actually uses this for its passwords. All HBO has to sell is access to its hit shows. And yet they don't just tolerate. HBO actually encourages people to illegally share passwords. Like, how is that possible that they do that? And it turns out to be a very savvy business strategy. So before we get into that strategy, let me just ask me, we have a second poll. That's actually, it's good that these are all working. Let's see if this one works. Here we go. So what do you all think? Is it okay, do you think, to share passwords with a friend? So is it okay to share an HBO password with a friend? Sure, everyone does it. Or no, that's not okay. That's actually just stealing from HBO.
If I may say so, I'm really delighted at how many people are responding to these.
Yeah, it's so much. It's like, why not? Like, you're here. When I ask my students in class, and I teach law students, how many of them illegally download content, out of a class of 100, 100 of them say, yeah, I illegally download movies and books and music. When I ask them, how many of you know this is illegal? Only about 50%. Only about 50% do this, know it, which is amazing. These are law students. And it's completely, let me end the poll. It's completely illegal to use an HBO password. And yet, HBO tolerates it, and they actually want you to do it. HBO could easily, and Netflix, could easily find out who you are and stop you. But they learned from the Napster debacle that suing your customers was a bad idea, and conversely, tolerating a certain amount of theft actually is enormously profitable for them. Richard Plepler, the guy who was president of HBO until just recently, he said, the reason we tolerate theft of our product is because we're building video addicts. We're building buzz. So Disney uses tolerated theft as an advanced strategy for product development, and HBO uses tolerated theft as an advanced strategy for basically customer acquisition. So this isn't this isn't what you think of when I own it, it's mine, I'm gonna defend it to the death. The most savvy companies at the sort of cutting edge of the content creation world actually tolerate and endorse a lot of theft of their product. So here in this, again, you guys split again almost exactly in half on this. Everyone does share it, and it is stealing, and HBO is okay with it. I guess that's the bottom line. Both answers are right, because HBO wants you to steal their passwords. It's not just HBO, Rolex as well. Rolex actually profits from having knockoff Rolexes. The best advertising for Rolex is knockoff Rolexes. It gets people thinking, I buy this knockoff, I'm a knockoff. I want to own the real thing. And a lot of their customer pipeline actually coming through people who originally start out with knockoffs and then over time save up to buy for the real thing.
So Michael, you told me something when we were speaking the other day or earlier today, that astounded me, and it had to do with the kind of lobbying efforts that the Walt Disney Company and others do to try to extend copyrights. And you said that one unintended consequence of extending copyright has been the relative difficulty for people to get authors, books by authors from that same period of roughly 20 or 30 years. Talk about that a little bit, and how such an unintended consequence, what kind of effect that has on the public, if they're even aware of it, which presumably they're not.
People are mostly not aware of a lot of these rules. I mean, the most of ownership happens sort of invisibly in the background, and it just sort of steers you through life without you realizing you're being shaped by this very small handful of ownership stories. You don't realize that the airlines are deliberately being ambiguous in order to sell that space twice. You don't realize that HBO actually knows that you're stealing it and wants you to do that. But on the copyright question, copyright, the point of copyright is to give as little protection as possible. Remember, the background rule is copying is good. Copying leads to a lot of innovation. And that's why fashion is constantly innovating. So we give copyright to give as little protection as possible to get people to write. If you give them too many years, what we want is eventually for all those ideas to become shared in the public domain, just like we have national parks. So the national park of ideas is all the stock of writing that we all can use freely. And those ideas fall into the public domain when the copyright term ends. Disney in particular, twice has paid for extensions of the copyright term, 20 years each time. Mickey expires now in three more years after 100. But it would have expired 40 years ago if they hadn't done that. And it's not just Mickey. There are millions of books and plays and choreography and movies from the 1920s and 30s and 40s that would all be freely available to us if Mickey hadn't been extended. And what that means is, especially if you're a short story writer, all those short stories are almost all out of print and impossible to reprint because you can't even find the owners. Today, there's much more stuff available from before 1920, from the 1880s and 1890s, than there is from the great flowering of American culture in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And that's purely an artifact of the sort of hidden cost of having too much ownership. So in a lot of my scholarship, a lot of what I end up arguing for is the added value socially, culturally, but also economically of less ownership. And this is a very good example where less ownership benefits even the reputations of the authors that copyright is meant to protect, because they fall out of view when their books can't be reprinted.
So, you're just talking about kind of the dispersal of ownership. I'd like to talk about the concentration of ownership as manifested in something I never knew before reading your book, which has to do with South Dakota and its laws governing trusts. Before we launch into that, I, like most of you, I suspect, have written checks for decades to Citibank, NA, South Dakota, without ever really understanding why Citibank would have set up shop in South Dakota for its credit cards. And the answer, which is in your book, is that they did that because the governor of South Dakota wanted to save or gain 400 jobs if Citibank would set up shop there to manage its credit cards. And to do that, he did away with the anti-usury laws in South Dakota, allowing credit card companies to basically charge, I won't say usurious, but certainly extortionate interest rates. So what did South Dakota then do that benefits the ultra rich in America?
One of the things people don't necessarily realize about who owns what in this country is that, for the most part, ownership laws in this country are state laws. It's not a federal body of law. It's not in the Constitution doesn't ever say this is what property is, ever, anywhere. So what that means is one state, one deviant state like South Dakota, can make rules that it turns out affect everybody. So if Citibank moves to South Dakota, they can undo what had been a sort of a cap on, a usury cap on interest rates in this country that dates all the way back to the Bible. So a lot of the debt overhang in this country, a lot of the people are swimming in debt. That's largely an artifact of a choice made in South Dakota to basically, it doesn't really harm a lot of South Dakotans, but it harms people all across the country to make that choice. Once South Dakota had that great success with abolishing usury caps, they said, hold on, what else can we abolish? And what they realized is they could attract really rich people's money to South Dakota by basically making a lot of taxation optional. If you bring your money here, a lot of taxation everybody else has to pay, you can simply skip. And by doing that, over the last 20 years or so, very small tweaks in the law of ownership, South Dakota is now the world's leading money haven. Like, for those of you who are listening tonight who are like super rich, you already know this. This is like not news to you. So you can like tune out for a minute. This is not for the 1%. This is for the 0.01 of the 1%. Once you're at the 50 to $100 million family wealth range. So if you're in that range, what South Dakota says is bring your money here. You don't have to come here. You're not going to pay any taxes here. We're not going to pave one road or educate one kid in South Dakota with your money. Don't worry. All we're going to do is basically create an optional legal system that lets you not pay taxes in New York or California or Texas or Florida. And because of that, South Dakota has now crushed Switzerland. It has crushed the Cayman Islands. So for those of you who still have Cayman's trusts, South Dakota is where all your friends are going. It has been a radical change in where the excess money in the world goes to. And I don't have a poll for this, but my guess is relatively few of you know this. But anyone who is really wealthy does. We've now created is basically two systems of ownership in this country. A very harsh system for most of us. And in the book, I talk particularly about one area that I've worked on a lot over the years, which is African-American land ownership in the South. There's been a 98% drop in land ownership by African-American families over the last century. It's a staggering land loss. And it's, we know a lot of the reasons: racial violence, racial discrimination, but there's also a hidden story that's buried deep in the sort of ordinary rules about who gets what within families. Family ownership is one of our 6 basic stories. And it's devastating for wealth, for basically wealth destruction in the African-American community. That's one poll, it's North Carolina, other southern states. South Dakota is the opposite. It's basically a rule that creates optional taxation and also optional responsibility. So if you want to stiff your spouse, or you want to stiff your kids, if you don't want to pay child support, or if you have a malpractice judgment against you, or if you want to stiff your business partners or stiff the government, the place you take your money now is South Dakota. And you might, for some reason, go to Nevada or Alaska, but South Dakota really has offered itself as the haven for super rich people.
And Michael, if I remember correctly, a lot of this has to do with the nature of their trust laws and the amount of time that trusts can pay out to beneficiaries. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so that the actual details of these rules are super small and technical. And for those of you who are lawyers in the room, it's so not worth getting into. I mean, we can, but it's super boring, and that's the point. So when family wealth advisors were looking for a state, they wanted to find a state where nobody would care. So there's a state legislator in South Dakota who says, and I think she's right, there aren't 100 people in the state who know this. And the guy who's the head of the Judiciary Committee in South Dakota, when someone tried to explain it to him, he was on the record saying, do not explain this to me. I didn't understand it in law school, and I refuse to understand it now. When he passed this law that allows $1 trillion to move into secret trusts in South Dakota.
One of the anecdotes that I liked, or the descriptions that I liked, was you said basically South Dakota has created laws that enable Maserati owners to crash their cars, kill other people, and not have to pay a dime in damages because of what you called spendthrift, or what are described as spendthrift trusts. Well, listen, enough on that. I don't know that we have.
Let me just close the bracket on that. If you drive a Toyota, though, and you hit someone, you're 100% liable. They can garnish your wages for the next 20 years. If you're a wage earner, they can come after you. But if you are a beneficiary of one of these trusts, you are completely shielded from responsibility.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Michael, is, and it's actually David Weinberg's question. David was Sidwell class of 81, and he and I were the same class in college. And he essentially asked, Michael's co-author is Jim Saltzman, who went to college with us. And David was asking kind of what the process was, how you wrote a book together. And if I might add, a book that is written with such verve. There are not a lot of books, I think, out there on property law that, make reference to Finding Nemo and the Flintstones. So how did you guys come up with the idea, and then how did you write it together?
We both got bored, to be very frank, about writing legal academic articles. We've both written tons of them. Actually, my last book before this one was on freedom of contract, what it means to be a free person in a world where you sign contracts with each other, where you bind yourself to other people. And for that book, there were literally, I don't mean this figuratively, there were literally actually 23 people in the world who who understood what we were writing for. There's 23 other legal philosophers. And we actually knew all of them by name. There was no like 24th reader of that book. Came out with Cambridge Press a few years ago, who
Not
we
your
didn't.
mom, not your dad.
Nobody. It's completely unreadable. And we both got super bored doing that. And we actually, I feel it's very strongly that it's actually something that comes from Sidwell. I think it's maybe something you feel as well, is a real sense of social obligation with the privilege that we have. And I feel that very acutely as a tenured professor. It's a super weird job to have tenure. Tenure is actually a feudal term, sort of carryover from feudal era, and it shouldn't exist today. But so anyway, so Jim also and I had written a popular book before. I wrote one called The Gridlock Economy, about how too much ownership costs lives. And he had written a trade book called Drinking Water: A History. So we were friends from the academic circuit. We said, let's write a book that doesn't have any law mention at all, that makes visible how important ownership really is in our daily lives and what people can do about it once they know. Like, it isn't the stuff that it's what we hope our students take away and go out into the world with. But we wanted to compress it down in a way that was literally, actually the original discussion was, what would be a book in an airport bookstore that people would just say, this is actually kind of fun. So the very first thought was, and our agent suggested this, was write Freakonomics for ownership, write Nudge or Predictably Irrational for ownership. And it turns out that Freakonomics is basically teaching really hard microeconomics, but through fun stories like, why do drug dealers live with their mom, or why do sumo wrestlers cheat? So we said that's actually right. So we then had working together. Part of what was so fun about that is, we're both at a stage in our lives where we can do what we really are passionate about, and just do that. So we were like, okay, let's do this together, and we'll audition stories. We're going to find like really fun, counterintuitive, or infuriating stories, and every story that we're going to deal with in the book has to pass that test. So we spent years going back and forth with each other, auditioning stories. Is this a fun story? Does this make a point that's actually pretty cool, like the airplane seat one? So
right.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. No, please go ahead.
So it's been super fun. So I love working together with somebody else. I love the social piece of it. One of the downsides of being a professor is it can be very, very isolating. And I love that we're always on the phone with each other all day long. And it's been for years now. We started this actually before the last book. We started this 5 years ago, and we've been just enjoying it so much. We weren't really racing to finish it. But it's, so we just trade drafts back and forth. Every sentence in the book, we've both written and rewritten again. We've had literally 100 drafts at least of every chapter, to the point where it's like a seamless piece of work, but it went through, and the sausage making was not pretty.
I remember you were once telling me, Michael, I asked you why you'd become a law professor, and you told me that it was the best ratio of dollars earned to hours worked ever found, because I think you only need to write like 2 articles to get tenure if they're brilliant articles. But I think at the time you probably didn't know how hedge fund managers are compensated, or B, how much law professors like you work. I got one more question that I would like to ask, which is kind of partly from the chat room and partly for something we talked about the other day. The Chinese, as we all know, have recently landed on the moon. What happens if and when the Chinese land on Mars and plant their flag? NASA, of course, has had rovers roaming the planet for decades now, I think, and they just landed a new one just in the last couple of weeks. But what happens? Who owns stuff in outer space? Who owns outer space?
Well, it's the same answer as who owns America. Like when the conquerors planted their flag, And they said, we're here first. Native Americans said, hold on, what are you talking about? We were here first. And the conquerors said, no, we're going to define first to mean us. So it's the same question now about like what counts as first for ownership in outer space. There are some treaties on this, but treaty law is very weak. So for example, when the US landed on the moon in '69, Congress actually passed a statute, resolution saying the US comes to the moon in peace. Our flag is not an ownership claim. And we come on behalf of humanity as a whole. But the flag could have been. So that's actually the traditional way conquerors would claim a place, was to plant their flag. The Russians actually recently, a couple of years ago, planted a titanium flag under the North Pole. The North Pole is territorially closest to Russia. And as climate change unfreezes the North Pole, it becomes very valuable for oil drilling and becomes very valuable for shipping. And the Russians are claiming it. And the way they're doing it is they actually planted a flag thousands of feet down, a little Russian flag on just like the US flag on the moon, except the Russians are saying, this is ours. The same is happening now for asteroids and for moon mining. And next is going to be Mars. And the usual rule is, unfortunately, is whatever the law is, doesn't matter. So if you think about Oklahoma and the Sooners and the gun, who people racing to take Native American land, it's who gets there first. Think about gold miners in 1848 in California. It was who gets there first. So first in time, one of the 6 basic ownership stories turns out to be very important. It's not just how kids line up for the Good Humor truck, not just how we put satellites in geosynchronous orbit, but it's also going to be the basis for claims on Mars and the moon. So Mary writes in the chat, isn't Antarctica divided between countries? This is very much up for grabs today. There are treaties, but again, it's the treaties are less powerful than many of these very basic ownership stories. Just the same, like the wedge on the airplane. The law is much less important than like what we actually do with each other.
Michael, how much of this is, I mean, you talk a lot about, possession, the phrase possession being 9/10 of the law. And one of the chapters is, in fact, possession is, 1/10. But how much does just sheer brute force might govern this? Yeah, if you get there first, but I show up with a tank, it's mine, right? I mean, how much of it is a question of who has coercive force over the others?
You can't understate the role of coercion underlying law. Like, what is law? I mean, law is state-sanctioned coercion over people to abide by a certain set of rules. Every piece of land in America, not like some pieces, every piece of land in America was bought, it's owned by somebody now, and was bought by somebody, and you can trace it back through a chain to conquest. There's like no other origin of the chain of title for any piece of land in this country other than conquest. And that's true in every country and every piece of land. And it's not just one conquest. What you have is a series of superseding historical injustices and genocides and conquests. Actually, I spent many years working in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. One of the big questions that we had to deal with there was how do you deal with the claims of people who were basically expelled from their lands by the Nazis or by the communists?
I remember when I was a kid, my dad told me a story about one of his colleagues who was a German man whose family had ended up fleeing East Germany. And I'm going to vamp a little bit while you get your headset.
I'm good.
But basically, the story was when the Berlin Wall came down, this man essentially wanted to go and pursue a legal claim for his family's home. And my family has now lived in the house I grew up in for a good half a century. And if it were expropriated, and 40 years later, I had the opportunity to get it back, I think I'd want it back. One of the things that I thought was super cool in the book was, and I didn't realize this, was that you said that a lot of post-communist Eastern European governments made a very deliberate decision And again, this is one of the cool things you illuminate about ownership design, that these are things that are designed and willed, was they decided not to allow people to just come back and say, well, that was my family's apartment 50 years ago and it was expropriated. Because what they, if I understood it right, what they wanted to do was to encourage privatization and encourage moving to a market economy. And if you suddenly dispossessed the people who had been living in these apartments for the last, half century, you would totally undermine public support for the other kinds of reforms that were being undertaken. One of the things I wondered about that was, though, did it lead to kind of lingering bitterness, lawsuits, and so on, or has that simply just kind of evaporated as an issue?
That goes back to your might makes right point. Of course, there's lingering bitterness, and there's no. This is true for ownership always. There's no correct answer for should you be able to lean back in the wedge of space or not, and there's no correct answer for whose home that should be, right? So it's always a choice. It's a choice between a family that was expropriated 40, 50 years ago by the communists or by the Nazis, and then there's also families that were put in those homes that were moved from somewhere else and have lived there for generations. So you have these conflicting claims that are essentially irreconcilable. It's not just Eastern Europe. If you think about reparations for African Americans in this country, it's exactly the same issue. Like, what should reparations look like? If you think about, I mentioned North Carolina earlier in the context of African American land ownership. But if you go back one step further, if you think to the 2 steps further, to the 1830 Indian Removal Act, that was where Seminoles and Cherokees lived before they were expelled on the Trail of Tears, which is basically a genocide. So why isn't land in North Carolina today? Why shouldn't that be owned by the Native Americans who were expelled from there? And that's going to be true going back everywhere. You have a series of these genocides and expropriation and expulsions. That's true in Israel and Palestine. It's true in Crimea. It's true in Kashmir. It's true in it's Miami exiles Cuban exiles in Miami. This is true all over the world. And you have to be thinking in terms of how you design ownership is what are you trying to accomplish? Like, what does it mean? What does justice mean in that context?
So listen, Anna, I think it's time for me to stop monopolizing the questions and stealing questions from the chat room. And can you now moderate the Q&A?
And we had quite a few questions come in. I think we could stay here for another hour and just ask questions. But one that I wanted to ask that is something that I think hasn't really come up tonight is, can you talk about any examples of community ownership, whether in the book or elsewhere, that we might be able to speak about tonight?
Well, I define community very broadly. Actually, it's something I think about a lot and I puzzle about a lot. So, for example, a family is a community, right? So in a family, it's sort of private property as to outsiders. You exclude the outsiders, but within the family, with your spouse and with your children, it's much more of a commons, the community regime, like what the rules are for sharing inside any community, as small as a family, as large as a co-op, as large as a larger scale community. There are many, many levels at which a community operates. And they all operate with the same 6 rules. We haven't had a chance tonight to go through what all 6 are. We've mentioned a few of them: first in time, possession, attachment, it's attached to me. But those same 6 stories operate internally in communities as well as externally about, the keep out story of ownership. The keep out story of ownership is a fairly modern version in America. And the sort of community version is a very deep and a very strong tradition in American law, but also in American life. Most of our lives are lived in community. In communities, a corporation is a community. A partnership is a community. A trust is a community. A co-op or a condominium. These are all forms of community constituted by law. And then we have many other kinds of communities constituted outside of law. So for example, if you ever wonder, where do your lobsters come from? From Maine. There's no law governing how those lobsters are taken. If everyone could just throw a lobster pot in, there would quickly be no lobsters. The reason Maine lobsters are one of the best managed fisheries in the country it has nothing to do with law. It's all about community. It's all about gangs located in harbors that are multi-generational, that have church ties and community ties. They meet at the same bar, and they are, as a group, are able to, as a community, are able to manage that resource to keep Maine fisheries from being overfished. There's actually a tremendous amount of power outside of law in community that only recently, only in the last 20 or 30 years, so someone I used to work with, a woman named Eleanor Ostrom, political scientist at Indiana. She won the Nobel Prize actually for coming up with an sort of discovering the vast world of how communities solve battles over the things we all want outside of law. So absolutely. So and I talk about this a fair bit in the book as well.
Great to hear. One of the questions that came in the chat this evening is, can you comment on drugs and medicines? And this seems like a place where sort of prolonging ownership rights is having a public and health cost. Is that something you can share some insight on?
This is something I feel very, very strongly about. So when we were growing, we're class of 1980, Arshad and I. 1980 was actually the turning point in the American rules around how drugs are made and who gets them, in a way that was, I think, not for the good. So before then, if you were a scientist and you discovered something, your reward was tenure. Your reward was publication. Your reward was reputation. But in 1980, when President Reagan came in, we shifted to a new regime. We made it possible to patent very basic inventions, very basic discoveries about research methods. Not the stuff not the pill in the bottle, the stuff that's like the basic tools that we need to do science. And all of those discoveries that used to be freely available to the public, like the parks, or like the public domain of copyright, were suddenly fenced in. It was like enclosure in England. That was all enclosed. And what that meant was a lot more patents. And paradoxically, that huge increase in patenting, this beginning of the biotech revolution, led to a surprising decrease in the number of pills that actually treated disease in bottles. So more property rights paradoxically led to fewer lives saved. But no one knows who to protest to. Like, who do you go to protest for a drug that wasn't invented, that should have been invented, that would have been invented, but for having too many patent rights? This is actually my couple books ago was a book called The Gridlock Economy. And that was the core focus of that book, how having too much ownership in the patent area, as one example, can lead to, paradoxically, too little of the actual stuff you're trying to accomplish through ownership, which is to make people's lives better. So I'm on the side that tends to be very skeptical of too much ownership, not no ownership, because you do need some ownership in the. Let me put this a different way. If you take the entire American patent system, it subtracts value from the American economy, according to the best study that I'm aware of. The entire patent system is actually value subtracting, except for one area, which is pharmaceutical patents actually do. The actual drugs in the bottle, not the research methods, but the actually drugs in the bottle cost billions to develop. And if they weren't patented, many of those drugs wouldn't exist. So that is one area potentially where, not as much as there is, but there's some justification for patent law. But most of the rest of it should be abolished. There's a question here about, I just seen from David DeMarco, and researching drugs derived from native plants. That's another great question. There's a whole field of so-called biopiracy. One of the things that drug companies do is they go and they find plants, a recent example in French Guiana, where they found a indigenous knowledge about a particular plant, distilled what the element was, and then patented that drug. I think that's outrageous. I think that there should be community ownership of sort of indigenous knowledge that has some defense against a patent system that doesn't recognize collective forms of knowledge and only individual ones. This also comes up, for example, with Navajo design. So Urban Outfitters recently had a bunch of, they had a Navajo patterned whiskey flask that they were selling. And the Navajo Nation sued Urban Outfitters, and Urban Outfitters wins because on the law, this sort of cultural appropriation is sort of invisible. But I think that's very wrong. Sorry to go off on that, but I just saw that question out of the corner of my eye.
Michael, what do you mean it's invisible? I mean, do you mean that cultural appropriation is just a matter of indifference as far as the law is concerned?
It doesn't scan. It doesn't scan in terms of, as there isn't a single identifiable owner. There's diffuse knowledge in a community, and diffuse knowledge is something that in general, we think should be freely copied. The diffuse knowledge about dress designs. Part of what's so creative about many different industries is that knowledge is freely shared. That was the rule of science as well, was free sharing of information before the biotech revolution. So there isn't an identifiable owner in the conventional legal sense. And because there isn't, it's treated as if it were unowned. Yes. John Locke wrote, in the beginning, all the world was America. And what he meant by that was that in his mind, America was unowned. Yes. It was unowned because Native Americans were essentially invisible. Right. They were invisible because the kind of labor that they didn't scan as productive labor. What counts as productive labor, counts as first in American law, is cutting down trees, planting things in rows. A certain vision of productive labor that made New England look like Old England. But if you didn't do that, you were invisible. And it's very much similar. It's very similar in the biopiracy area.
Anna, I'm now going to become invisible, and let's go back to you, please.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. One that I wanted to ask was about personal data. This came in also from Mary Rassenberger, who's here tonight. I'm going to read her question so I don't mess up the point of it. The internet behemoths have made vast amounts of money off of our personal data for advertising, not just our demographics, but everything we look at and buy online. The service one is using claims that data for themselves, and users waive any rights to privacy through click wraps. We talk about protecting this kind of data under privacy laws. What if instead we had the ownership right in personal data, including any data a person creates online, and not to allow the transfer of it through clicking and without fair compensation?
Mary, I want to adopt you on the book tour. That is such a great question. Here's how I think about it. So what Mary's asking about is your clickstream. So if you ever noticed, for example, like you decide to fly to Chicago for the weekend, and then everywhere else you go on the internet for the next week is like ads for Chicago hotels. The reason that happens is that everywhere you go is tracking you. They're tracking your likes and your looks. They know everything about you. They know more about you than you can imagine. What medicines you take, what diseases you have, how you vote. All of that is in the files of even how you vote. And that information is worth billions of dollars. That's actually what powers the internet economy, is your clickstream, what you like and what you look. And that question of who owns that today is absolutely up for grabs. And I think for me, what's so cool about working on this book, when I realized that working on this book, is that the clickstream is the identical story as the wedge of reclining space on the airplane. It's the identical story. So what the airlines are saying, what Amazon is saying and Apple is saying, is they're saying your data is attached to our app, right? So it's the same principle that the button attaches the wedge in the airplane seat, and they're using that same story. There's only 6 stories, and they're using the attachment story.
Michael,
and what? Go on.
Tell them what the 6 stories are. Finish your answer, but then tell everybody the 6 stories.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to go one different direction before I answer. We actually wrote a poll, which I guess we weren't going to use, but now we didn't do that one. Okay. Well, I was going to actually ask you, like, how many of you think you should own your clickstream, and how many of you think no, that's just the price that I pay for using these apps? But we didn't ask it, so I'll have to guess what you all think. But here's the thing: like, it's the same with the airplane wedge. So the big tech giants have their story, and that story feels natural and obvious and right. Like, they assert it first, and that happens all the time whenever any new resource emerges, like the airplane wedge, because airlines squeeze you together, or the clickstream. But there's a different story. You can push back the same way Arshad pushed back with the story of possession. You can say, no, that story, I possess that story. And if you're going to lean back, you're trying to lean back into my lap. And I'm going to have actually on an airline, there's a device that keeps the seat from leaning back. It's called a knee defender. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can create virtual knee defenders that keep the big tech giants out of our clickstream. My sense is that kind of a story, like, once you see that it's not that complicated, that it's possession versus attachment for clickstreams, I hope what it means is that you can be a little bit more effective as an advocate yourself for change, as a citizen and as a consumer. So Mary asked, is the clickstream just about privacy? And privacy is fundamental. Privacy is actually a part of what ownership does, is it creates a zone for privacy for people who have property. Like one of the questions always is, how about the people who are excluded? For people who have property, what ownership does is help create privacy. And thinking about the clickstream in terms of ownership lets you say, well, it's not just about keeping the tech giants out. Maybe it's also about inviting them in, but getting paid and recognizing the value of what you're contributing. If you add up the total amount of advertising value from clickstreams and say, okay, we're going to give half of it to the big tech and keep half of it for ourselves, each one of us, every single person in America, will get a check for between $100 and $200 a year. That's the monetized value of the clickstream from a couple of years ago. It goes up every year, and we're not getting paid for that. So I think this is another example of how seeing the handful of ownership stories. So Arshad asked me, what are the 6 stories? So here are the 6. It's mine because it's attached to something mine. This is your home is your castle. The stuff is attached to it up and down. It's mine because I'm holding on to it. Possession is 9/10 of the law. It's mine because I was first. You see kids in the playground, I had it first. First come, first served. It's mine because I worked for it. You know, you reap what you sow. That goes back to the Bible. That's actually the intuition that drives why we have copyrights and patents, the dessert for that work. It's mine because it comes from my body, self-ownership. And that traces back to the history of slavery and forward to questions today about gestational surrogacy or selling eggs or sperm. And the 6th and final one is family, which we talked about tonight as well, which has these 2 very harsh sets of rules. Family ownership, it's mine because I'm in the family. All ownership of everything in the world traces back to one of those 6 stories.
Well, as a mother of an almost 2-year-old whose very favorite word is mine, I can say it truly does. Michael and Arshad, thank you so very much for being here tonight, for sharing about your insight and your knowledge and your experience. We deeply, deeply appreciate it. To reiterate again, the book is Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. And tell us again when it's going to be out.
I just got the hard copy of it. Got the pie on the front. Anyway, super honest. It'll be out next. It's coming out on Tuesday, actually. It's so exciting. I can't even tell you. It's so exciting to have it. This has been such a labor of love for so long. We actually have there's one last thing I was mentioned. We have a very cool website. So we've been trying to put a lot of free stuff up there because we feel like we want to get the ideas out there. So one of the things we have up there is a free ebook called The False Promise of the Buy Now button. Like you get a lot less than you think when you click Buy Now. So, and you can download that. We have a bunch of videos up there. It's on mindthebook.com, mindthebook.com.
Anyway. I just threw that link in the chat so folks can go and see it. There's lots of information up there. I really, truly appreciate all of you being here tonight. As always, we are only able to put these kinds of events together when we have alums and community members who are willing to be featured in them and who are willing to come to them. So we're grateful for each and every one of you. Michael and Arshad, thank you. And have a great night, everybody. We'll see you soon.
May I say one thing, Anna?
Sure.
I'm one of the few people who's actually gotten to read the book because Michael sent me one of the galley copies. It's delightful. Buy it. You'll enjoy it. Michael can't say that. I can't. It's delightful. You should get it.
I get one last word. Thank you, Anna.
Yes.
You guys out there listening, you do not realize how much work goes into putting something like this on. Anna has done so much work to put this on. She does this, in event after event. It is such a privilege to be here. I have my little Sidwell background. It's such a privilege to be here. And Anna and the other staff members who are on tonight, thank you so much.
We appreciate you very much. I'm going to take our spotlights down, but thanks everybody, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.